Hello, everybody. Please come on in. Welcome in this session where we continue to talk about data. We have 4 speakers, 3 of whom will show a tool which is dealing with data and what you can do with that. And 1 is talking about code and how can you maximize the value of the code that is being used in scientific research. So we start off with Luiz Olavo Bonino, who is CTO Fair Data at DTL, which is the Dutch Techcentre for Life Sciences.
So, good afternoon. I think that I didn't know about the previous talks, but I think that it complements and builds up on what they said very nicely. That from a little bit over 3 years, we have been working in this idea of data to be fair. Does anybody here already know what fair data means? Few. So just briefly, there was this movement 3 years ago, got a lot of people together to discuss the kind of nightmare of finding, accessing, interoperating, and reusing data. And sometimes you need some data. It was in your PhD student's laptop. It graduated, left, and data are gone, and things like that. So we decided to come up with a set of principles that we could use to help tackling all these issues. So data should be findable, and then we have some principles about that. We should have, for the data and the metadata, we should have globally unique persistent identifiers, DOI, PIDs, and things like that. Describe rich metadata. For accessibility, we should explicitly say what are the conditions that you need to access the data and who is eligible to access the data. So fair data doesn't mean that data should be open. It means that it should be accessible under well-defined conditions. And the same for interoperability and reusability. When you're looking at these 4 letters or 4 main groups of principles and all these principles, we notice that many of them are related to metadata. So we could tackle these issues just focusing on the metadata, which is it's kind of easier than dealing with all the data and the hundreds and thousands of different types of data representation, data formats and models and so on. So I try to highlight which are the principles that are more directly involved with the metadata. The same, some of these principles are related to data. Some of these principles are related not to data or metadata, but to underlining supporting infrastructure. Do we need a persistent identifier? But these identification systems, the identifier systems, they are an infrastructure. They are a service that you can apply and request an identifier, register there, and so on. The same for storing the data, accessing the data, some protocols, some data repositories, and so on. So I try to divide these concerns. We have been working on all these 3 aspects, the data, the metadata, and the infrastructure. But here I would like to focus on the metadata. Just for you to have an idea, we have been working in the last 3 years and developing a set of an ecosystem of applications, starting when you need to plan for your project or your data activities, what kind of data you're going to create or reuse, and how, where you're going to store, how you're going to format, and things like that. So we have a data stewardship wizard being developed to help tackling this, and also to help complying with the latest Horizon 2020, for instance, requirements. That if you look at the new regulations from January, we have around 38 items that related to fair data and stewardship. And then you create data, and then you need to make your data fair. We have a tool that's called the verifier, or a kind of event that's called the BYD, bring your own data. And once you have the data fair or the metadata you want to publish, we develop a sort of data repository, but we are not focused on all the functionalities for data lifecycle or actually storing, but we are focused on how the repository can express, can expose the metadata and the data in a fair way. So we are calling the fair data points. And to help people developing, currently developing their repository solutions to adapt their own applications and solutions to comply with the fair data point specifications, we have these fair hackathons. And ultimately you need a search engine that can index this metadata and allow people to search. And we are working on an example of a fair data search engine. And all of these will come together to a more complex, comprehensive interoperability platform that we are calling the Data Fairport. So about the metadata, we are, and the way that we implemented the fair data point, we start looking from a data user perspective. What do you need to know about the data to decide whether, first to find it, to decide if you can access, and if so, how, if you can integrate that with other data that you may have, and what information is necessary, and ultimately, how can I reuse the data? So starting, we have a layered approach for metadata content, starting at the data repository level. We are trying to reuse existing standards or guidelines as much as possible. So we took the RE3 data repository schema for the content of metadata about the data repositories themselves, who is responsible for this service, this repository, what are the licenses for using, and things like that. Then you have, once you can trust the repository, you want to know what's available. So what are the catalogs, the collections of data sets that you have. So these are the catalogs. Then you move on, you found a specific data set that you may be interested on. You want to know more, who is the author, what's the data set about, what's the version, issue date, and so on. And for each data set, you may have different ways of representing. So you may have one data set that's represented as a XML file, as a PDF, as a CSV, as an Excel sheet, RDF, and so on. And you can have multiple distributions, multiple concrete representations of this same data set. These three layers of metadata we are reusing from the W3C standard called DCAT, extended a little bit with HCLS. And finally, that's the most complicated one, is the data record. Once you know all of this, you want to know what's in there. What are the types? If you're talking about global observation, you're talking about images or analysis about a specific region of the Earth. So what's a region? What kind of information units, measurement units you are informing, and what are the related information that we need to understand the data. And this is the data record. This is just an example of the interface of the fair data point that exposes this metadata until the point that you can actually reach the data. And this is the interface that is target for techies, for the developers that are interfacing with this application programming interface of the fair data point. For the regular users, the normal people, let's say, we have a graphical user interface, HTML-based interface that actually interacts with the underlying API and brings the same information. So we have this region that on the top part we have information about the repository metadata, who is responsible, a summary of the service, and then the catalog, and then we have a summary of the catalog, so we can have multiple catalogs. If someone clicks on one, gets more details about that catalog, and below you have summary cards for each one of the available data sets already containing some information else about the distribution. You select one data set and then you get a more complete information. Then this is the stack of metadata content, and of course this is just the core. We can expand this in different ways with different vocabularies. If you want more information like relationships with between data sets and publications. We have some standards like DATS, like Scolix, that we can provide this information as an example here. Okay, if you need further information, please contact us. Thank you.
Please, Pierre. He's going to talk about CodeOcean. It was already mentioned in the previous session, and we are very interested to hear about your project.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. So, yeah, actually, it was great to come after the last session because also I will be advocating for that software and code become a first-class citizen. And the reason is more and more of our research now includes code. And when you get to a research paper, a lot of times in articles, there'll be figures in the article, and behind those figures, a lot of times, is some code or software. And the figures then are interesting, of course, but more and more researchers now want to see the actual computational environment, the code, the software that produce those figures. And so I think it's worth looking at how we curate code and software moving forward. Right? And the company CodeOcean was actually founded by Simon Adar. And Simon Adar is a spectral imaging engineer, and these are actually photos of him doing research in the field. And before he actually went into the field, he wanted to really look at the literature. And CodeOcean came out of the trouble that he had in actually getting to the code and software behind the actual findings in articles. This is really what you need to do, and I try to lay out these steps of what you would need to do if you wanted to get the code up and running, right? So you'd have to find the code. A lot of times there'll be a link to the code in the actual article. Maybe it points to GitHub, but a lot of times you'll actually have to email the PI and say, hey, read your article, you mentioned code, you had some great figures, could you point me to the code? And the PI, if they respond, would point you to that code. So that is actually the easiest thing you're going to do in this step process. Right? Then you've got to get the code up and running on your machine. You got to make sure that you have the right language. You have to make sure that you have, well, like what Ian was talking about, the stack, the right dependencies within the text. So if you're using Python and you want to do deep learning, you've got to make sure that you have Caffe or TensorFlow, whatever packages you have in the actual language. And then you enter into something a lot of people call dependency hell. This file depends on this file, depends on this file, depends on this file. And you know, it can go really deep, right? All to get one piece of code up and running. And then when you get it up and running, you're going to have to share it with your colleague probably. That's overseas or something. And you know, a lot of times that can be like, you know, trying to teach, you know, an elderly parent how to use a DVR or something. It's very, very difficult because you have to recreate all the steps that you just did. So CodeOcean does basically all the 6 steps for you, and all researchers have to do is just press the run button, and boom, the code will execute in the cloud, right? So I'm hoping I have a bigger shot of that, and I do, and I will come back to that slide a little bit later. But this is what CodeOcean is. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, we separate the code files from the data files. So it's the researcher that goes into CodeOcean and makes this deposit, because they're the person that's best suited to put their code up and running. They know their code. And we've created a very intuitive environment where they don't necessarily need to be expert coders to deposit their code. So they're putting the code files on the top left. They're putting their data files on the bottom left. The actual window in the middle is actually the code window, and they actually can go in there and they can actually just type. Start coding directly into the window. And then, of course, the results are on the right-hand side. The researcher will do this complete workflow, press publish, and then there'll be some output. There'll be an output results file that will go and get published. And then other researchers can come to this compute capsule. We call it a compute capsule. There's a DOI that's given, and there's metadata that goes along with this. And there's a bidirectional link to the actual article. So when you go into the metadata section, it's called details here, but we actually changed it to metadata. You will see a bidirectional link directly to the research article. And then other researchers can come here and actually just click the run button. Right? And so I'm actually going to go back to this slide because not only is this an added service that we can provide authors in terms of allowing them to deposit their code in software and get a DOI for the software so it can be independently cited along with their article. But it also goes a long way in addressing what some have called a reproducibility crisis. Crisis may be the wrong word, but why I just wanted to capture this as a nature survey. What I find really interesting about this is I completely understand other researchers going and having troubles reproducing other researchers' work. But what's interesting here is researchers themselves have difficulty reproducing their own work. And I don't know, let's take a moment to think about that. And I'll tell you why. It's not because they're being malicious or they're p-hacking or anything. It's that much of the time in terms of the code and software, the stuff that they save is the really nice stuff, right? It's the big code, it's all the code in the code window. But you'll notice there's a lot of tiny files that need in order for this code to run. Maybe they forget the shell script or a particular package. And the reason they forget that is because it's not exciting, right? What's exciting is the actual code. And so this is, it's too bad I can't go online and show you, you can actually execute it, and that's a real advantage over things like GitHub, right? So, and that's when you hit the run button, you can look at some outputs as well. Some of the outputs are nicer than others, obviously. So this is the current landscape now, and this is my pitch. This is what I would really like to see change. People are in the journals now. They find some code, and they have to leave the journal and go to another repository in order to access the code. And sometimes it's actually embedded right into the journal, but most of the time people are leaving the actual journal to go to a repository. So we've also developed a widget very similar to a YouTube widget, which allows researchers to, and publishers to embed the actual compute capsule, you'll see the compute capsule right here, right directly onto the article page, or as a researcher, directly onto my website, right? And it allows someone who's reading the article, when they get to the code, they can just press the run button, they can look at the data, they can look at the code, they can download the data, they can download the code, they can change the input values. There's a lot that I can talk about in terms of collaboration, in terms of reuse, but we don't have time to go into that. I'm just trying to give you a really brief overview. And so, at the end of this, why is it important? For reproducibility first and foremost, right? But impact as well. I mean, having a citation on your code as well as your article is tremendously beneficial. Reuse, this will speed up the pace of science, because when other scientists get to the particular code, they don't have to waste their time trying to get it up and running. They can immediately start bringing in new input values, augmenting the code and everything. And then it really does allow publishers to move beyond the PDF. So thank you very much. Technical question, right?
Hi, Pierre.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
Enjoyed it. So there's a slightly technical question. The piece of code that you showed was Python.
Yeah.
But there was also a little MATLAB symbol in the corner there, and there was a MATLAB file as well. Now, Python is free, so that's not necessarily a problem, but MATLAB is not. Yeah. So what do you do about the fact that some of these coding languages are not free?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. Thank you very much. So actually, one thing that publishers love about us, so not only do we support 10 languages, MATLAB being one that is not open source. Also, on our development servers right now, we have Statica, and we're about to deploy that probably next week. So that's also another language that is not open source. So we actually manage the license. A lot of times we'll use a Flex MNL license. So every time someone runs the code on those particular algorithms, when someone clicks the run button, there is a fraction of a second of delay, because we will call the MATLAB servers, authenticate the license, right? And then, so the license doesn't, it's not a dependency whatsoever. All we're doing is authenticating the license for the user, right? And it's beneficial for MATLAB as well, because if a researcher finds a particular computational capsule that's running on MATLAB, and all of a sudden that researcher is like, yeah, I can build off this work, chances are that researcher is going to buy a MATLAB license. So we do, de facto, we do manage licenses.
Okay, thank you very much. Next speaker is Nees van Eck. He works here just around the corner at Leiden University, and he has developed the VOS viewer, and he will talk about that now.
Well, thank you. So I'm working as a researcher at Leiden University, and at my research center we are developing tools to analyze and visualize the structure of science, and we also want to analyze how science develops. So we have developed VosViewer. It is a software tool that can be used to analyze and visualize scientific literature. It's quite popular among scholars in the field of bibliometrics and scientometrics. The tool can, for example, be used to get a very quick overview of the structure of a scientific field, to get an overview of the important topics that are discussed within the field, and to get a quick overview of the main actors that are active. So here we see a screenshot of the software tool. In the left screenshot we see a visualization of a network. It is a co-citation network of journals in the field of economics and management. And this network has been generated based on a collection of metadata about scientific articles in the field of economics and management. And VosViewer is able to analyze all the patterns that are hidden in the metadata of those publications, and then this structure is found by the software. So it's providing an overview of the important journals in the field and how they are related to each other. So in this case the software has found 5 main groups of journals. So economics, finance, accounting, management, marketing and business, and operations research. The software tool has scroll and zoom functionality to facilitate a detailed exploration of the visualizations. We have search functionality, different visualization features. So the networks can also be visualized in different ways. So network visualization and overlay visualization, but also a density visualization. So we have support for different file formats. So we have support for the most popular bibliographic databases, so Web of Science, Scopus, PubMed, but we also support the so-called RIS file format used by a lot of reference managers. And we have also a new feature. So quite recently we have implemented a link to Crossref. So we are very excited about that because until now VosViewer was a software tool without any data, so the user needed to provide the data to the software tool, but now we have also a direct link to a data source. So we've also implemented text mining functionality, so natural language processing techniques to analyze textual data, and the software tool is also providing advanced visualization features. So the researchers, they are the main users of the software tool. So researchers that want to get an overview of their field and to have a better understanding of the topics that are discussed, and maybe the researchers also want to find other researchers to collaborate with. So on the right we see a graph, and this graph is showing the number of scientific articles in which VosViewer has been used per year. So we see a clear increasing pattern, and until now the tool has been used in more than 500 scientific articles. So the tool is also used by research institutions, especially by research managers who would like to answer all kinds of policy-related questions, academic libraries, research funders, and also several scientific publishers are making use of the tool. So different networks, different visualizations can be constructed using the software tool. So citation networks of publications, for example, co-authorship networks to analyze how researchers, or organizations, how they collaborate with each other, co-citation networks, bibliographic coupling networks, and co-occurrence networks of terms or keywords. And all those different types of networks and visualizations, they provide a different aspect of the underlying data set. And altogether, they provide a very rich and in-depth analysis of a particular field, for example. So this is best to explain with an example. So I've collected an example data set So this data set is containing the metadata for almost 3,000 publications that are published in 3 major journals within my own field, so the field of bibliometrics and scientometrics. I collected the data using Web of Science, and I've also collected data from Open Access DOI to say something about the open access status of the different publications. The first type of network visualization that can be constructed using the tool is a so-called term network. And using a term network, we get a very quick overview of the most important topics that are discussed within the dataset. So the software tool has natural language processing techniques to identify the most relevant, the most essential terms in the titles and abstracts of the publications. And based on the co-occurrence relations between those terms, they are located in a two-dimensional visualization, and they are also assigned to a group. And in this way we get an overview of the most important topics. So in this case 4 topics has been identified by the tool. In green we see citation analysis. It's an important topic in our field. In blue case studies, yellow network science, and in red information retrieval. Then using the software tool we are also able to create so-called overlay visualizations. And this is a time trend overlay. So the structure of this map is exactly the same. So the locations of the terms are exactly the same. The only thing that is different now are the colors. In this case, the color of a term reflects the average publication year of the publications in which the term occurs. And then yellow, orange and red are associated with more recent literature, and the blue colors are associated with older literature. So in this case we see that the topics on the left, they are present in somewhat more recent literature, and this is valuable information. This is another overlay, a citation impact overlay. So now we see a lot of red colors in the top left. So this is the topic of citation analysis. So within the field, this topic is attracting relatively most citations. This is an open access overlay. So it's showing us the green and hybrid open access. And again, we see the red colors in the left top. So again, this topic of citation analysis. So it's both attracting most citations, but also a very high percentage of the publications are published as open access, so green or hybrid. Overlays for the different journals to get a quick overview on which topics they are focusing. So in this case, the 3 different journals, they are focusing on somewhat different topics within the field. And the journal in the top left is focusing on, well, the citation analysis topic. You can also create an overlay for the different countries based on the affiliation data of the authors. So from those pictures we can learn that the authors from the US, that they are most focusing on information retrieval, so the topic on the right. Well, if you look at authors from China, they are most focusing on the case studies within the field. This is another map. So this is not a term map, but this is a co-citation map of journals. So the journals that are cited by the scholars or by the publications in our dataset. So from this visualization we can learn that the scholars are not only making use of the journals from the field of scientometrics and bibliometrics, but also they are also citing journals from research policy, management, computer science and library science. So this is a type of information that we can learn from such networks. And finally, the last example is a co-authorship network of authors. So in this visualization we see some main researchers that are active in the field and how they collaborate with each other. And by analyzing this visualization we can identify the main research groups within the field and how they are connected to each other. So more information about the software tool can be found on our website, forceviewer.com. The tool is also freely available, so you can download it from the website. So you can start immediately working with the tool and create your own visualizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that's very interesting. I'm Tony ORourke. I'm here with Inargo, who provide researcher services, and I'm also a consultant. That's a really interesting historical perspective. I'm just wondering from a more current perspective whether you've thought about using other more current sources like preprints, for example, to populate the visualization, or even databases of funded research. So you can see, which areas are being funded in which regions and what's getting the most traction. Yeah. Have you considered other types of content rather than just to publish journal articles?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there are more and more data sources that become available. And one particular type of data we find very interesting is the full text data. Until now, most tools are not making use of the full text, but only the metadata about the scientific publications. And we think that we can gain much more if you look at the full content of the articles. So
are you doing using TDM to extract full text, or are you just using the abstract and metadata?
So there are some initiatives. Some publishers are now also providing their full text data in, for example, XML format, so that is very easy to parse. It would be wonderful if more and more publishers follow the same path.
So we're moving on to our last speaker, who is Tom Lickiss of ÜberResearch, part of digital science, and he will talk about what he's working on at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak also, Astrid. ÜberResearch, the first question we often get from people who've not heard of ÜberResearch is, what do you have to do with taxis? And we have nothing to do with taxis, despite the fact occasionally we get some flack on Twitter from people who are angry with the other Uber and are throwing their problem. We had someone tweet us a while ago saying, so ÜberResearch can tell us how much funding there is in a certain area, but they can't tell us how much they pay their taxi drivers. I'm telling you this because I've just realized on all of these slides I've completely forgotten to put the ÜberResearch logo on. So now you'll hopefully have that association in your head, and that will remind you of the name of the company, because you're not going to get it from the slides. We are one of the portfolio companies of digital science. I'm sure if you don't know about digital science, you will have heard of one of our sister companies, Altmetric, ReadCube, Figshare, etc., etc. We're in the same group. So without further ado, what I'd like to talk to you about briefly in the next 7 or so minutes is what we've done with a tool called Dimensions. And essentially the idea behind Dimensions was a tool for funders, not a tool for publishers. And the idea was very basic. It was looking at research funding. What can you learn from research funding? From a funder's point of view, obviously they want to know what other funders are funding to make sure they can place their research funds in a as well as possible to do with their strategic goals. And actually we started to think about it and think about, well, actually a lot of people, for obvious reasons and very good reasons, are focusing on publications, citations, and to a certain extent conference proceedings talking about research, but actually those are all outputs of research, and we wanted to look at the inputs to research, which were the awarded grants, the money which is being spent on funding for a certain area, and that's what we've done with Dimensions. So over the last few years, I think we've had Dimensions about 3.5, 4 years now. We've now built up a database, an analysis tool called Dimensions, which now contains 3.6 million funded grants from hundreds of researchers around the world, hundreds of funders around the world, which is growing all the time. This represents $1.1 trillion now in funding. And we've built it so that you can search by keywords, you can search by pasting in an abstract, you can use standard categorization tools, you can build your own categories. We want to make it so that regardless of your query, it's very easy to pin down exactly what you're looking for, whether it's just something that mentions a keyword or a gene name, or whether it's a kind of more of a general idea that you have. We help you to define that so you can search the database and find anything which is relevant. And for this audience, what I wanted to talk about was the applications we're now moving into to help publishers use this information to get information out of it for their goals. This is what the tool looks like very briefly. This is the new UI actually, which is going to be released very soon. We also have publication information in here, so you can see at the top I've searched for CRISPR, just a very basic keyword search. You have the filters down the left-hand side. You can filter for any of the normal things you would expect, time, the researcher, the funder group, the country, the area of research, etc., etc. You have the results in the middle, and then on the right-hand side you have a slide over which then does some analytical visualizations and analysis for you. You can add filters. Nothing as nice as the pictures we just saw from the VOS viewer, but we're looking into things like that as well. And for publishers, the questions this can help answer are things such as what I have here. So what's the research activity in our area if you're a small society publisher? What's the global research activity? Who are the people, up-and-coming people, or people who've been established? What funding have they recently had awarded? How does that compare with our journal spread, particularly thinking in terms of development? So CRISPR, something that came up relatively quickly, there's a little trend view there. You can see the green line is showing you the number of active research projects in CRISPR over time, over the last 10 years. So you're looking 3 or 4 years ago, you basically wouldn't have seen anything at all. Now CRISPR is a massive thing, not just in science, but also generally worldwide. A lot of people recognize what that is. And how can you spot those things coming? How can you predict what might be a big thing in publishing in a few years' time? And these are the kinds of things that the publishers are now talking to us about because they're interested in how they can use this information. Another aspect to the tool that we've built in is something that helps to identify referees for manuscripts. So I mentioned we have publication information and also as well as the funding information. So what we do with this is we have machine learning working in the background, natural language processing. And the tool basically works as you simply either have a light integration with a management tool, or you can copy and paste in an abstract or a piece of text of interest. The tool will automatically then show you all of the people we have in the database ranked by how relevant they might be to this particular paper, so that suggesting essentially who might be good people to have as referees, and you can also filter them to people who are in a certain country or people who've worked in a certain category of research or people who've published in the last couple of years. And it also gives you also a good idea of potential conflicts of interest. Has this person published as a co-author with the applicant or with the person submitting the manuscript, and do they work at the same institution? You can do this based on publications. You can also do it based on funding. So you can say, okay, well, I want to find reviewers not based on who's published in this area, but who's receiving funding right now. If this is a really fast-moving area, I want to know who's just received funding for this really cutting-edge thing, so that I know that this person is really up to speed on this topic. And just finally, another thing that we've started to do now is to produce what we call the funding analyzer. This can be used in a number of different ways, but essentially the idea is thus. What you're seeing here is a version of Dimensions which is filtered to just any project in Dimensions which is to do with bladder cancer. And we've done this for the Journal of Bladder Cancer. It's available on their website. You can go straight to the Journal of Bladder Cancer website right now, click on the funding button, and anybody who visits that website can say, I want to explore what's going on right now in research funding in bladder cancer. And you can search this portal just by typing in a keyword. You can do the same filters, the same searches you can do in Dimensions, but it's just limited to that area of research. Although obviously those projects could be coming from anywhere in the world. This is updated live through our system. So what it's basically doing is just filtering the Dimension system. So as new projects come in, these will appear on the site as well. And we've done implementations of this. So this one, as I said, this one is freely available to use. We can also set this up for society publishers or smaller publishers that would like to keep that just for their members only. We can do that as well. And many funders are actually using this because they actually want to use it not just externally to show the people who've given them money, the charity organisers, what they're doing with the money, but also to use it internally to say to whoever's working in the institution, what are we funding at the moment in area X? So they don't have to go to the research department to ask them, what are we funding right now? They can just use it that way. So this is another way in which we're starting to move in the direction of how can we use this funding information for publishers. If you're interested in anything I've said, there are plenty of digital science people in this room that I can help you out with, and I will be running off to get a train in half an hour. But if you need to contact us, digital science is the place to start. ÜberResearch is our name, and you won't forget that now because I told you the story that we're not to do with taxis. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question, Tom, to you? I am a massive fan of Uber. I think it's brilliant to be able to bring that funding data together, which I guess that was what you were asking about. Now you've kind of got outputs, so publication outputs in there. Are you sort of wondering about the next steps and including things like preprints, software? That's obviously the next step here, because then you are linking the inputs of research funding to all the outputs, and obviously articles is the place to start, but where next?
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is that there's lots of different areas of potential for that. So what we've started to do at the moment is we have publications which are essentially reflected by PubMed within Dimensions, and we are building links between those publications and funding projects. But obviously there are lots of other data sources. It's all to do with not only which ones are the most interesting for people, but obviously which ones are the most accessible, and which ones have the quality, many of the themes we were talking about already, the quality of metadata, the quality of things that we would need to make those links. But like I said, the short answer is yes. We're thinking about it. You won't see it in the next 2 months, but it's these are things we're thinking about, and it's an obvious. Everybody wants to see it happen because I think there's a lot of systems, not just ours, that are moving in this direction. Not necessarily having all of the data in one place, but having the links between them so that everything's to do with interoperability, etc., etc.